News of the times. The Wheelbarrow Murder. The case that led to Hereford Gaol's last execution in 1903. Tonight, we open our firsts and lasts of January series with a case that unsettled rural Herefordshire and would culminate in the final execution ever carried out at Hereford Gaol. In the spring of 1903, a quiet tragedy unfolded on a lonely quarry pit, a wheelbarrow, a body, and a story that, at first glance, looked like nothing more than a drunken misstep in the dark. But as the authorities began to peel back the layers, a far more troubling truth emerged, one that would lead us to a sensational trial, a national debate on mercy, and the last time the gallows at Hereford would ever be used. In this episode, we step inside the world of early 20th century justice, its assumptions, its blind spots, and its grim rituals, as we follow the investigation that transformed a seemingly simple accident into one of the most significant murder cases in Herefordshire's history. This is the story of the Wheelbarrow Murder, a tale of exhaustion, deception, and the final echo of an ending era. And in today's further particulars, a reminder that Victorian funerals were not always the serene, dignified affairs we imagine. In this case, the coffin made a determined bid for an extra passenger with regrettable success. Honestly, only in Victorian England could a burial end up requiring a second burial. Settle in. Let's begin. Quarries and quarrymen in 1903 rural England. At the turn of the century, the rural quarries of England were harsh, self-contained worlds shaped by danger, dust, and the heavy rhythm of physical labour. Long before health and safety regulations, a quarryman's daily day balanced constantly on the edge of risk. Rock faces sheared away without warning, ledges crumbled underfoot, and the air hung thick with grit that settled into lungs, hair, and clothing. Men arrived before dawn, often walking miles, and worked with iron wedges, hammers, and blasting powder. Almost everything was moved by hand, stone dragged in carts or tipped into wheelbarrows that weighed nearly as much as the men pushing them. Injuries were so common they scarcely merited comment. Fatalities, too, were accepted as part of the trade. In small villages, quarrying was often the only viable employment beside farm labour. The men who worked these pits formed tight, stoic communities, poor, strong, and accustomed to pain. Tempers could shorten under such conditions, resentments brewed easily, and old grievances simmered beneath the surface. Yet there was pride in the craft. Quarrymen understood stone the way sailors understand the sea, its weight, its fractures, its hidden weaknesses. Their labour helped to build bridges, farmyards, schools, and cottages across the countryside. By 1903, the local quarry was more than just a workplace. It was a pressure cooker of exhaustion, poverty, and masculine temperament, a place where a simple tool, whether a shovel or a wheelbarrow, could take on terrible significance. In such an environment, the line between accident, anger, and tragedy could blur quickly and irrevocably. The Haywoods, a family on the edge of respectability. William Haywood, at 61, was the sort of man instantly recognisable in rural labouring communities, stout, powerful across the shoulders, and roughened by a lifetime of hard outdoor work. A roadman and quarry labourer, he relied on strength long after age suggested otherwise. When sober, he was considered steady enough. When drink was involved, his temper shortened considerably. His wife Jane, 2 years younger, had shared the weight of his working life as much as any partner could. Together, they had raised 6 children, the youngest only 11, and the villagers recalled seeing husband and wife labouring side by side in the quarry, William breaking and levering stones, Jane stacking what he was cut. It was the quiet choreography of long marriages among the rural poor. But beneath this outward respectability lay shadows that were not fully explored at trial. It later emerged that William had once faced a charge of outrage involving one of his daughters, a grave allegation that, if pursued more fully, might have altered both public feeling and judicial approach. There was also mutterings of hereditary instability within the family, although nothing of this was formally introduced in court. What remains is a portrait of a household common to early 20th century England, hard-working, financially fragile, bound together by necessity, and carrying private burdens behind closed doors. In the case of William and Jane Haywood, those hidden pressures would collide with physical exhaustion, drink, and a single terrible moment, setting the stage for one of Herefordshire's most memorable legal lasts. The quiet routines of the little village of Aymestrey were shattered one summer evening when William Haywood appeared outside the local inn pushing a wheelbarrow with the lifeless body of his wife inside it. To the astonishment of those who saw him, Haywood seemed neither frantic nor grief-stricken. If anything, he was remarkably self-possessed, offering only the briefest explanation for the terrible sight before them. It was a scene so stark, so deeply wrong, that within hours the rumour travelled the length of the valley. Something dreadful had happened in the quarry. From the Daily Express, the 14th of July, 1903, quarry tragedy. Wife's dead body wheeled away in a barrow. Aymestrey, a picturesque village in Herefordshire, has been startled by a tragedy in one of its historical limestone quarries. A roadman named William Haywood is accused of murdering his wife, and yesterday he was remanded at the Leominster County Police Court. His work consisted of breaking and cutting stone in a quarry situated in a quiet spot half a mile away from the nearest residence. His wife helped him in his work, and they appeared to be on good terms until Friday last, when Haywood, it is said, spent a considerable time at a public house. When his wife asked him to leave, he became annoyed and stayed away from his house all night. On Saturday morning, his wife left the house with her husband's breakfast. Later, the man again went to the public house and said his old woman had something the matter with her and ought to have a doctor, as blood was oozing from her ear. Then he left, and afterwards James Davis saw him wheeling his dead wife in a barrow in the direction of his home. The police were communicated with, and Haywood, who had a scratched face, was arrested. He said, "It was a pure accident. I must have hit her as I was throwing up stones from the bottom of the quarry." Then he said he would drown himself and made a rush for the river, but was secured by the police. The woman's body was removed to the mortuary. She had terrible wounds on the top of her head Her left leg and right arm were broken, and her left arm was lacerated. She was 59 years of age and had 6 children whose ages ranged from 36 to 11 years. The villagers of Aymestrey were stunned. However rough country life could be, however hard the work in the quarries, a man wheeling the broken body of his wife to the inn was beyond anything they had ever witnessed. Yet, even in the face of this horror, William Haywood remained calm, almost unnervingly so, insisting to anyone who would listen that Jane's death had been a terrible accident. But as whispers travelled and as more came to learn of the scene in the quarry, that explanation began to feel increasingly hollow. Jane's injuries were extensive and inconsistent with the simple mishap her husband described. The ground around the site was torn up, suggesting struggle rather than misfortune, and the sheer violence of the wounds raised questions that no one in the village could easily answer. For detectives and for the reporters converging on the case, the first task was clear: to untangle truth from the tale Haywood stubbornly repeated, a story already buckling under the weight of physical evidence. What really happened in the quarry that afternoon? Why did William Haywood believe that anyone would accept his explanation? These questions formed the starting point of an investigation that would soon grip the nation. From the Bromyard News, the 16th of July 1903, Herefordshire tragedy. Alleged murder near Leominster. Husband removes the body in a wheelbarrow. The beautiful and picturesque district around Mortimer's Cross was the scene of unusual excitement late on Saturday night. The cause of the commotion was the rumour that a terrible tragedy had been enacted in a lonely quarry situated in the Poke House woods. The rumour was only too true. A tragedy had taken place, with the result that a woman had been killed. How she was killed is a question to be decided by a jury. Up to the time of writing, very little evidence had been given against the husband of the victim, who is in custody on the charge of having wilfully murdered his wife. The evidence will be slowly unfolded in the courts, and it is not our duty or wish to publish anything that would prejudice a jury or interfere with the proper course of justice. The victim is Jane Haywood, aged about 59 years, and her husband, William Haywood, aged 61 years, is in custody on the capital charge, the quarry. Poke House Quarry lay tucked within Poke House Wood, a secluded limestone pit about 3/4 of a mile from Mortimer's Cross and directly across the river from Aymestrey Church. Reaching it required cutting through the mill yard and along a narrow path skirting the hillside, a route familiar to locals but invisible to anyone passing on the main road. It was quiet, isolated and shielded by trees, a place where a man could work all day without being seen. The limestone there was rich with fossils and used by the Leominster Rural District Council for road repairs. William Haywood raised the stone. His wife Jane stacked it behind him, the rhythm of their daily labour. On the Sunday after the tragedy, hundreds of villagers walked the same path to the quarry, drawn by the grim rumours. What they found confirmed the worst. 2 finished stacks of stone stood untouched, beside a third partly built, almost certainly Jane's last task, and it lay a wheelbarrow beneath an oak tree, its tray smeared and splattered with blood. The ground around it told the story of a struggle. Loose stones kicked side, splintered wood stained dark, tools scattered as if dropped in haste, a hammer, 2 crowbars, planks, a small bag of blasting powder, a fuse, a basket holding part of a loaf, even a little briar pipe, all laying where they had fallen. It was clear from the first glance that whatever had happened there had not been sudden, nor gentle, nor accidental. Some particulars. What happened in the quarry we do not yet know. That remains the missing chapter in this grim story. What we do know begins the previous evening. William Haywood and his wife had been in Leominster shopping on Friday and returned together as far as Yarpole. Mrs. Haywood went home, but her husband continued on to the beer house. Later that evening she went to fetch him, asking him to come home. He refused. She returned a second time, and only then did he accompany her back. Witness noted he was in a nasty mood and was heard to say, "If ever you come after me again, I'll daub your nose for you." He picked up his tools as if intending to work that night, but he did not return home. The next morning, between 7 and 8 o'clock, Mrs. Haywood left home carrying her husband's breakfast to the Pokehouse quarry. She never came back. The story next picks up at about 8:30 on Saturday night. A local man named James Davies encountered Haywood near Mr. Hellaby's fold yard, pushing a wheelbarrow containing the blood-covered body of his wife. A brief conversation seems to have passed between them, and the disturbance quickly roused the occupants of the nearby house. A servant girl ran in alarm to the Mortimer's Cross Hotel, crying that a woman had been hurt in the quarry. Within minutes, Mr. J. Jones of Mortimer's house and Mr. T. Morgan of Mortimer's farm hurried to the mill yard, arriving shortly after 9 o'clock. There they found Haywood standing beside the barrow, propping up his wife's head. She was clearly dead. Mr. Price immediately sent for Police Constable Priest and Dr. R. Williams, who arrived soon after. Haywood, meanwhile, walked calmly about the yard, showing no outward distress. He simply told those present, "It was quite an accident. I wish I was along with her. I must have been throwing up a stone which accidentally hit her." Unconvinced, P.C. Priest arrested him on suspicion of causing his wife's death. Later that night, Haywood was taken to Leominster Police Station. The injuries. We cannot at this juncture give any official details as to the injuries. These will be described by the doctor at the inquest. Speaking generally, the injuries were as follows: left leg broken below the knee, right arm broken at the elbow, left arm bruised and badly lacerated, face badly cut and bruised, and a severe scalp wound. The inquest opens. The inquest opened that Monday afternoon at Mortimer's Cross Hotel, a familiar village gathering place, now turned for the day into a court of inquiry. William Haywood stood beside Police Sergeant Lee as the proceedings began. A stout, weather-beaten man of 61, dressed in cord trousers and a blue work coat. His red plaid shirt buttoned tight at the throat. Scars marked his forehead and wrist. Those present later remarked that he seemed strangely unconcerned. Before hearing any evidence, the coroner instructed the jury to view the body of Jane Haywood, not as a mere formality, he said, but to observe it carefully so they might better judge the manner of her death. Jane had died 2 days earlier. Her husband, he added, with casual neutrality, was charged with causing that death, though the jury must not permit that fact to colour their judgment. Only the evidence of identification would be taken that day. The more substantial testimony would come after adjournment, when the full sequence of events could be laid before them in its proper order. The stage was now set. The formal machinery of Edwardian justice had begun to turn, and all eyes were on William Haywood. Testimony began with the daughter Elizabeth reviewing the events of the fateful day when her mother Jane spent her last morning carrying breakfast to the man, her father, who would end her life. The first witness was Elizabeth Haywood, the couple's daughter. Dressed in black and speaking with steady clarity, she confirmed that the body the jury had viewed was indeed that of her mother Jane, aged 59. Elizabeth had last seen her alive early on Saturday morning, sometime between 7 and 8 o'clock, when Jane left home carrying breakfast for William at the Poke House quarry. William, she added, had not returned home at all the previous night. With these brief formalities completed, the inquest was adjourned until the 20th of July, when the fuller evidential picture would begin to emerge. But before the inquest adjourned, events took an unexpectedly emotional turn, a moment that laid bare the devastation within the Haywood family. At the close of the inquest, a painful scene occurred. The prisoner was removed from the room to the closed carriage. His three daughters went toward the carriage for the purpose of talking with him and were allowed to do so. For a full 10 minutes, they conversed with their father and bore up bravely. One, however, broke into tears. The oldest of the three sons did not take any part in the conversation, but at one time his feelings overcame him and he rushed forward toward the open window of the carriage. Seeing that his intentions were not of a friendly character, he was forced back by the police officers who surrounded the carriage. After the prisoner had had a conversation with Mr. Spencer as to the age of the deceased, he was conveyed back to Leominster. It was a brief scene, but one that captured the turmoil the trial was already stirring. Grief, loyalty, fury, and the bewildering collapse of a household. The legal process would continue, but the family's fracture was already complete. From the Bromyard News, the 23rd of July, 1903, Herefordshire tragedy. Inquest on the victim. Verdict of wilful murder. The village of Kingsland was the scene of unusual excitement on Monday morning on the occasion of the adjourned inquiry into the circumstances attending the death of the unfortunate woman Jane Haywood, who met with her death in a quarry in the parish of Lucton under circumstances detailed in the last issue. The inquiry took place in the Cross Room, kindly placed at the disposal of the coroner by Dr. R. Williams. There was a large attendance of the general public, many of them having travelled many miles to be present. The prisoner, William Haywood, who is charged with the wilful murder of his wife, was present in the custody of two warders from Hereford Prison. He was seated not far from the witnesses and took considerable interest in the proceedings, evidently following the evidence carefully. The medical evidence. Dr. Williams' post-mortem revealed that Jane Haywood had suffered multiple blunt force injuries, a compound fracture of the left leg, extensive bruising across her arms, legs, face and head, and a severe wound consistent with a heavy blow. The official cause of death, he stated, was shock from trauma to the brain, combined with the range of other catastrophic injuries. But the most shocking discovery came when he confirmed that 2 stones produced before the court had been forced into the body before death, a detail that left little doubt of deliberate violence. Dr. Williams described examining the body on the night of July the 11th and again during the post-mortem the following evening. Her clothing remained saturated with blood, and he later found additional bloodstains on the garments removed from William Haywood, as well as on a stick recovered from the quarry. There was undigested food in Jane's stomach, no scent of alcohol, and no indication of any sharp instrument being used. All wounds, he said, were consistent with blows from something blunt, a stone, a stick, or even a boot. When he first saw her, he estimated she had been dead 5 to 6 hours. The picture painted was not one of accident, but of sustained, brutal assault. The next witness was Elizabeth Haywood, the couple's daughter, who repeated and expanded upon the account she gave at the opening of the inquest. She explained that on the Friday her parents had been much as usual. They went out together shortly after midday and returned around 1 o'clock, staying home for about 20 minutes before Jane went out again to the Bell Inn. She returned, left once more for a short while, and then came back within 10 minutes. A little later, William arrived home. He was in what Elizabeth described as a nasty mood, warning her sharply not to fetch him from the public house again and threatening to daub her nose if she did. Apart from that, he said little. He stayed barely 10 minutes, took his dinner with a cup of coffee, and then left, saying he was going to work. Elizabeth confirmed that this was the only night he had ever failed to return home, making his absence notable. Her mother, Jane, had been helping William at the quarry for the past 2 or 3 weeks, and on Saturday morning she left between 7 and 8 to take him his breakfast. Elizabeth recognised the basket her mother carried that day, as well as the bonnet she wore. She also identified her father's tie and cap found at the quarry. Elizabeth never saw her mother alive again. She confirmed there had been no quarrel between her parents the previous night beyond the exchange which she had already described, and that her father had appeared sober when returning from the Bell Inn. The next witness, Edwin Everall, a stonebreaker lodging at Yarpole, described the couple's movements on the Friday. He was at the Bell Inn taking his dinner when William Haywood arrived shortly after 1 o'clock and ordered a quart of cider. A few minutes later, Mrs. Haywood entered the inn. She told her husband that his dinner was ready and asked him to come home. She poured out a small tot from his cider, drank half of it, and sat beside him briefly before leaving. Everall heard Haywood say, "You go on, I'll follow you down," but did not see her again that day. The following morning, Everall saw Mrs. Haywood while he was at work. It was about 20 minutes to 8, and she was walking toward the quarry carrying a basket. The last time he saw her alive. John Payne, landlord of the Mortimer's Cross Inn, testified next. He knew William Haywood by sight, although not Mrs. Haywood. At around 7 or 7:30 on that Saturday morning, Haywood came into the inn. Payne served him a pint of beer, which he drank quickly, then asked for another, and a bottle to carry it in. Haywood also requested a bottle of Irish whiskey, paying 3 shillings for the lot. Payne saw him again later, between 1 and 1:30 that afternoon. Haywood appeared dishevelled, hat and coat missing, his shirt hanging partly out of his trousers. Addressing Payne as Jack, I want a drink, a familiarity he had never used before, he was instead brought a bottle of ginger beer, as the landlord did not believe he was drunk, but recognised something was amiss. It was then Haywood said quite abruptly, "There is something the matter with my old woman. I ought to have the doctor." He added that blood was coming from one ear. Payne told him the doctor had already gone towards Aymestrey. Haywood made no further explanation, and Payne, needing to attend to customers, thought little more of it. He noticed no blood or marks on Haywood at midday. Later that night, when the police brought Haywood back to the inn during their inquiries, Payne saw him again, under very different circumstances. Frederick Reynolds, a baker from Kingsland, testified that he was standing outside the Mortimer's Cross Inn at about 1:15 on the Saturday. He heard Haywood invite someone to have a drink, to which landlord John Payne replied that he would be better off with a ginger beer. Reynolds thought Haywood looked as though he'd had some alcohol, but he was neither drunk nor fully sober, merely unsteady in manner. While Payne was inside fetching the ginger beer, Haywood leaned toward Reynolds and made a startling remark. "I threw a stone at my old woman, and I've hit her just above the ear. It's bleeding, and I can't stop it. If she's dead when I go back, I'll bury the old hag in the brook." With that, Haywood walked away in the direction of the mill. Reynolds did not raise any alarm at that time, although he mentioned the exchange later to a Mrs. Roberts in Aymestrey. Questioned by the coroner, Reynolds confirmed that Haywood seemed perfectly capable of understanding what he was saying and doing. He walked upright, showed no signs of delirium or confusion, and gave no impression of being irresponsible for his actions. The incriminating statement, Reynolds added, had been made quite quietly while Payne was still inside fetching the ginger beer. As the investigation widened, detectives and villagers alike began to trace Jane Haywood's final movements through the quiet lanes and footpaths of Aymestrey. The morning errands, the ordinary greetings, the glimpses of her basket swinging at her side, all of it formed a timeline against which William Haywood's shifting explanations would soon be tested. Two key witnesses now stepped forward, each offering a snapshot of the hours before and after the killing. Mrs. Mary Davis of Lucton testified that she saw Jane Haywood at around 8:45 on the Saturday morning. Jane was passing her house carrying a basket. They exchanged a few words before Jane continued towards Pokehouse Wood and the quarry. Later that day, as Mrs. Davis and her husband walked towards Aymestrey, they encountered William Haywood coming towards them, pushing his wife in a wheelbarrow. Haywood set the barrow down as they approached, and Mrs. Davis believed he spoke first, telling him he had been chucking stones out of the quarry and had struck his wife on the head without realizing it. He added little else before lifting the barrow again and saying only that he was taking her home. Mrs. Davis noted Jane's position, her legs hanging between the barrow handles, her head drooped to one side, no bonnet. She saw no blood, although she heard a slight moan. Haywood did not ask for help, nor did they offer. He appeared perfectly sober. The next witness, Farmer William Morris Price of Lucton, described arriving at Mortimer's Cross Mill at around 9 o'clock on the Saturday evening after hearing the alarm raised by the Helleby's servant. When he reached the mill yard, he found Haywood crouching beside the wheelbarrow, cradling his wife's head and shoulders in his arms. Her face bore signs of blood, although Price noticed it appeared to have been recently wiped clean. Price asked what had happened. Haywood repeated the same account he had already given others. "I was throwing stones up out of the quarry, and one must have struck her on the face." When a bystander remarked that the woman was already dead, Haywood replied, Never. Poor girl, I hope. Price suggested lifting her from the barrow onto the nearby green sward. She was done. Haywood then spoke wildly of drowning himself, and Price tried to steady him, saying, "What's the good of that, boy? That won't mend matters." Realizing the seriousness of the injuries, Price urged that the doctor and police be fetched, and helped secure transport from Mr. Payne, who had just arrived with his trap. When Police Constable Price reached the scene, Price accompanied him as they examined the body by lantern light. Her injuries were extensive. One leg appeared twisted out of place and had been tied up with something. The constable struggled to undo the binding until Price lent him a knife. During this time, Haywood began wandering off toward the bridge. Price alerted Price, who ran after him and brought him back before formally placing him under guard. Price helped move the body to Mortimer's Cross, where the doctor soon arrived. He recalled that Haywood had briefly entered the inn earlier, telling those inside that he had had an accident with his wife. He drank when offered something. He attempted to purchase more and only stood down when Price advised against it. Crucially, Price noted that there were moments when the body was left unattended, and that Haywood still insisted at the mill that his wife was alive when he wheeled her there. With the lay witnesses exhausted and a grim picture already forming, the inquest now turned to the men who first encountered Haywood at close quarters, the police officers who examined the scene, the body, and Haywood himself in the critical hours that followed. Their accounts would strip away the last veneer of accident, replacing it with something far darker. Step by step, their testimony charted the movement of the wheelbarrow, the condition of the quarry, and the injuries that no single flying stone could ever explain. It is through the voices of these constables and sergeants that the events of that July afternoon, the quarrel, the violence, the wheelbarrow journey, and Haywood's shifting explanations would be laid before the jury in stark, clinical detail. And it is with their evidence that the inquest reached its turning point. Police Constable Price was the first officer to reach Mortimer's Cross Mill on the night of the 11th of July. He found William Haywood lying on the grass beside the body of his wife. When questioned, Haywood claimed he had accidentally struck her with a stone whilst he was filling the barrow in the quarry. He said he found her on the ground bleeding, washed her face with water from a bucket, tied up her injured leg, placed her in the wheelbarrow and brought her to the mill, where, he insisted, she expired in his arms. Priest examined the body and immediately noted that the injuries were far too severe for a single accidental blow. He also observed scratches on Haywood himself. When Haywood wandered toward the bridge, the constable intercepted him, arrested him on suspicion of causing his wife's death, and arranged for the body to be taken to the inn while summoning the superintendent and the doctor. Later that night, Priest and Superintendent Price inspected the quarry by lantern light. What they found contradicted Haywood's account entirely. The scene showed unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. The bank pressed down and the soil slipped and flattened. A large area of ground 4 to 5 feet long saturated with blood. The wheelbarrow itself heavily blood-stained. A hacker and several sticks smeared with blood, including a long, heavy post marked with cuts. A bonnet, handkerchief and personal items soaked in blood, and a bucket containing bloody water, and even a fragment of hair and flesh. Importantly, they found no fallen boulders or large stones capable of causing the catastrophic injuries seen on Jane's body, only small chips that could not explain her wounds. The gate on the quarry path had also been knocked from its hinges. Superintendent Price later measured the distance Haywood had wheeled the body, 1,416 yards from the quarry to the mill. When formally charged, Haywood maintained it had all been a pure accident, but the officers were unequivocal in their view. The scene bore every sign of sustained violence, not misfortune. PC Edward Rogers from Leominster stated that on Monday the 13th he was on duty at the lockup at Leominster at 7 a.m. When Haywood asked for his clothes, he then began muttering something about his wife which the witness could not understand. He said he could not think how it happened unless a stone hit her as he was chucking them up. He said, "I had a bottle of whiskey there and put 3 parts of it in a bucket of water to drink, and my wife drank some of the rest out of the bottle. I wonder if that got over her. She seemed to lose her senses before the accident happened. I found she was hurt and washed her head in water and tied her leg up. I didn't know what to do with her, and I put her in the barrow thinking to take her home. But I could see she was getting worse on the road. I stopped and picked her up in my arms, and she drew her last breath." The coroner then reviewed the evidence. All along, Haywood had stated that it was an accident. They must put that version against the weight of this other evidence. Referring to the nature of the injuries from the head to the feet, including a broken leg, he asked them if it was possible that they could have been inflicted by an accident as stated. The 2 stones found in the body of the woman, could that have been an accident? One act of violence was clearly proven, and they could thereby assume that the other injuries were caused by acts of violence. The jury then consulted in private for a quarter of an hour and returned a verdict that Jane Haywood was wilfully murdered by the prisoner William Haywood. Haywood was then committed to take his trial at the next assizes. With the inquest verdict delivered, the case against William Haywood moved from suspicion to certainty. He was formally charged with the wilful murder of his wife and sent back to Hereford Gaol to await trial. There he remained from July until early December, 5 long months in which the prison warders formed their own rather unflattering impression of him. By their accounts, Haywood was one of the most difficult and unpleasant prisoners they had ever had the misfortune to supervise, sullen, unpredictable, and rarely cooperative. If his behaviour revealed anything, it was this. Whatever had happened in the quarry that July morning, Haywood was not a man inclined to self-reflection. Still, process had to be followed, and on the 3rd of December 1903, the case was finally brought before the Herefordshire assizes. Crowds gathered, journalists filled the benches, and the courtroom settled to hear the arguments that would decide Haywood's fate. From the Bromyard News, the 3rd of December 1903, Herefordshire assizes. The Lupton murder prisoner sentenced to death. The Herefordshire assizes, held before Mr. Justice Bingham and lasting 3 days, had a very tragic ending on Saturday when sentence of death was passed upon a wife murderer. The prisoner, a stout, strong, rough-looking roadman with a short-cropped beard, named William Haywood, aged 61, stood charged with the murder of Jane Haywood, his wife, at Lupton on July the 11th. Throughout the proceedings, which occupied the whole of the day, he never uttered a word beyond his plea of not guilty. The prosecution opened with a stark outline of the final 24 hours of Jane Haywood's life. On the day before her death, William and Jane had returned home to Yarpole after a visit to Leominster. That afternoon, William lingered in the nearby public house. When Jane came to fetch him, as she had done before, he reacted badly, warning her that if she came after him again, he would daub her nose. He did not return home that night. By early next morning, William was seen again at a local inn, purchasing whisky and beer before heading back towards Hoke House Quarry, where he worked, and where Jane habitually brought him his breakfast. She was last seen walking towards the quarry with a basket at about 7:30. By midday, William appeared once more at Mortimer's Cross Inn. His clothes were disordered, his face scratched, and in an unguarded moment he told a bystander, "I threw a stone at my old woman. Her ear is bleeding and I can't stop it. If the poor old hag is dead when I get back, I'll bury her in the brook." Nothing more was seen of Jane until nearly 9 that night, when William was discovered trundling her lifeless, battered body in a wheelbarrow. When challenged, he offered the same explanation he had given since the moment of arrest, that he had been throwing stones up out of the quarry and he must have struck her without realizing. A subsequent examination of the body and of the quarry itself revealed that Jane Haywood had been brutally and extensively injured. When apprehended, Haywood appeared dazed but entirely sober, and the authorities noted no outward signs of insanity. This became the core of the defence. Dr. Morrison of the Hereford County and Lunatic Asylum testified that insanity had existed within the Haywood family and that William's long-standing drinking habits had caused denigration of the brain, potentially affecting his responsibility at the time of the killing. A powerful plea was made by counsel in this direction, and in summing up, the judge said that the jury had strong evidence that the prisoner knew he had done wrong. The fact that he had invented an untrue explanation so as to exculpate himself was in itself strong evidence that the man knew he was doing wrong, and that, if possible, he must get out of the circumstances. There had been nothing in the prisoner's conversation, demeanour, or conduct in prison to show he was not in his right mind. The jury retired for about 20 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty. The judge, wearing a black cap, said he was sorry to say the verdict was absolutely right, and then pronounced the sentence of death in the usual terms. Previously, the prisoner had served 5 years for outraging his daughter, and a long list of previous convictions for drunkenness and assaults were read out. The verdict left little room for mercy. Haywood was returned to Hereford Gaol, where he spent the final 2 weeks of his life under the shadow of the noose, a man whose violent temper had finally caught up with him. And so, in December 1903, Hereford Gaol prepared for what would become its last execution. From the Brom Yard News, the 17th of December 1903, the execution of the Lupton murderer. At Hereford on Tuesday morning, William Haywood was executed for the murder of his wife in a quarry at Lupton in July. Haywood, a quarryman in the employ of the Leominster District Council, was seen wheeling his wife in a barrow. Her head had been battered in. The condemned man appeared utterly indifferent till a few days ago, but later he paid the closest attention to the ministrations of the chaplain, acknowledged the justice of his sentence, expressed penitence, and stated that drink was the cause of the crime. He walked calmly to the scaffold, and when the bolt was drawn, death appeared to be instantaneous. Henry Pierpont was the executioner, and he was assisted by John Ellis. Reporters were not present at the execution. It is said that Haywood had been one of the most callous prisoners ever detained in the county jail. He went so far as to utter a threat as to what he would do before he died if he had the opportunity. He smoked incessantly and exhibited a spirit of bravado until the end. Little sympathy seemed to have been felt for him. Haywood was dressed in the clothes he wore at the trial: brown corduroy trousers, leggings, and a blue jacket. His indifferent manner had disappeared, and he presented a haggard appearance. And so ends the case of William Haywood, a man whose final act of brutality reverberated far beyond the quiet quarry at Pokehouse Wood. His execution in December of 1903 marked a turning point. It was the last hanging ever carried out at Hereford Gaol. The final time its scaffold was assembled, its bell tolled, and its gates opened to receive witnesses for the ultimate punishment. After Haywood, the old rituals of Victorian justice in Herefordshire fell silent. The story leaves behind uneasy questions about poverty, drink, violence, exhaustion, and the thin line between domestic life and disaster in rural England at the turn of the century. Jane Haywood, who spent her days stacking stones beside her husband, met her end in the very place where she had laboured to keep their household afloat. Haywood's late conversion to penitence, blaming drink, acknowledging guilt, came too late to alter the path he had set in motion. The law, the jury, and the public all agreed this was not misfortune nor madness, but murder. With the closing of the gallows at Hereford Gaol, the case stands as the final chapter of an older, harsher age of justice. Further particulars. Now, for today's further particulars, a reminder that Victorian Britain could make even a funeral more dangerous than the crime itself. Only the Victorians could contrive a situation in which the coffin successfully kills a man before it reaches the grave. From the Illustrated Police News, the 2nd of November, 1872, killed by a coffin. Dr. Lancaster held an inquest on Saturday evening at the University College Hospital on the body of Henry Taylor, aged 66. The evidence of E.J. Redding, an undertaker's foreman, and others showed that on the 19th the deceased was engaged at a funeral at Kensal Green Cemetery. The church service having been finished, the coffin, as mourners proceeded in coaches toward the place of burial. The day being damp, the foreman directed the coaches with the mourners to proceed to the grave by the footway, and the hearse across the grass towards a gravedigger who was motioning the nearest way. The coffin was moved from the hearse and being carried down a path only 3 feet by 6 inches wide by 6 bearers, when orders were given to turn so that the coffin, which was what is known in the trade as a 4lb leaden one, should go head first. While the men were changing, it is supposed that the deceased caught his foot against a side stone and stumbled. The other bearers, to save themselves, let the coffin go, and it fell with great force on the deceased, fracturing his jaw and ribs. The greatest confusion was created amongst the mourners who witnessed the accident, and the widow of the person about to be buried nearly went into hysterics. Further assistance having been procured, the burial service was proceeded with, while the deceased was conveyed to a surgery and ultimately to the above-mentioned hospital, where he expired on the 24th. The jury recommended that straps should be placed around coffins, which would tend to prevent such accidents. The verdict: accidental death. And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of tonight's tale. You may now safely unclench, finish your tea, and reassure any nearby wheelbarrows that they are not under suspicion. If you've enjoyed the episode, we would be enormously grateful if you'd like, subscribe, or share it with someone who has ever attempted DIY, moved heavy garden equipment, or simply enjoys watching the YouTube algorithm quiver in confusion. Every click helps our little corner of historical Britain escape the algorithmic oubliette. And if you'd like even more stories, more than 800 episodes, all ad-free, with daily uploads and a wealth of exclusive historical crime, scandal, curiosities, and the occasional weak attempt at British humour, you can join us over on Patreon. It keeps this channel going and lets us keep digging through the archives, so you don't have to. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, amateur fossil enthusiast, part-time Victorian postcard holder, and full-time avoider of suspicious wheelbarrows. We'll see you next time. Same news of the time, same news of the time, place.